Hello friends and welcome back. Today, we journey into one of the longest and most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. A war that reshaped the Middle East and left scars that are still visible today. It was a war of borders, of pride, of ideology, and of immense power struggles. This is the story of the Iran-Iraq War. The year is 1980, the month September. Iraq, under the iron fist of Saddam Hussein, unleashes a full-scale invasion of its neighbor Iran. Saddam's calculation was simple: Iran was vulnerable. The nation was still reeling from its dramatic Islamic revolution in 1979, which had overthrown the Shah and brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power. The military was in disarray. The government was new and untested. Saddam saw his chance. He aimed to seize resource-rich territory, assert Iraq's dominance over the strategic Shat al-Arab waterway, and establish himself as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. The invasion was swift and brutal. Iraqi fighter jets streaked across the sky, dropping bombs on Iranian airfields, crippling the Air Force before it could even get off the ground. On the ground, columns of tanks rumbled across the desert frontier, pushing deep into Iranian territory. Major cities like Khorramshahr, a vital port in Abadan, home to one of the world's largest oil refineries, were besieged. The initial assault was a shocking success. The world held its breath as two regional giants, one Arab and secular, the other Persian and theocratic, clashed in a conflict that seemed destined to engulf the entire region. Both leaders were resolute, each determined to see the other's regime crumble into dust. But Iran, against all odds, did not shatter. Ayatollah Khomeini, in a series of powerful speeches, galvanized the nation. He framed the invasion not as a political conflict, but as an attack on Islam itself, calling it the imposed war and rallying his people to a sacred defense. His call was answered with a fervor that stunned the world. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers, including boys barely in their teens, joined the Basij, a paramilitary force, and flocked to the front lines. They were often poorly equipped, but they fought with a burning conviction, driven by a powerful blend of nationalism and religious faith. For many, the idea of martyrdom, dying for their country and their beliefs, was a path to paradise. The war quickly devolved into a grim, attritional nightmare, bearing a horrifying resemblance to the trench warfare of World War I. Both sides dug in, creating vast, static networks of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire that stretched for hundreds of miles. The battlefields became a hellscape of mud, smoke, and death. In this brutal stalemate, both Iran and Iraq resorted to one of the most desperate and costly tactics imaginable: human wave attacks. Thousands of soldiers, often the young and inexperienced Iranian volunteers, were ordered to charge directly into heavily fortified Iraqi positions, straight into a hail of machine gun fire and artillery shells in an attempt to overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers. The war wasn't confined to the front lines. Cities on both sides became targets. A war of the cities began, with long-range missiles raining down on civilian populations in Tehran and Baghdad, spreading terror far from the battlefield. Oil fields, the economic lifeblood of both nations, were set ablaze, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. And then came the chemical weapons, a specter from a darker age. The battlefields became shrouded in a silent, invisible poison. By 1982, the tide began to turn. Through sheer determination and immense sacrifice, Iranian forces launched a series of successful counteroffensives. They pushed the Iraqi army back, liberating key cities like Khorramshahr in a victory celebrated across Iran. At this point, the war could have ended. Iraq, having lost its initial gains, was ready for a ceasefire. But Iran, feeling the momentum and smelling victory, made a fateful decision. Khomeini was no longer content with just defending Iran. He wanted to punish the aggressor and topple Saddam Hussein's regime in Baghdad. The Iranian army crossed the border and invaded Iraq. The sacred defense had transformed into a war of liberation, or, from the Iraqi perspective, a war of conquest. This decision prolonged the conflict for another 6 agonizing years. The front lines barely moved, but the casualty counts soared into the hundreds of thousands. Year after bloody year, the war ground on, consuming a generation of young men. In villages across Iran and Iraq, families waited anxiously for news of their sons, brothers and fathers, but for so many, that news never came. The war became a black hole, swallowing lives, resources, and hope. As the conflict raged, it drew in the world's superpowers, who saw the war not just as a regional tragedy, but as a geopolitical chessboard. The United States, officially neutral, began to quietly support Iraq, fearing the spread of Iran's revolutionary ideology. They provided Saddam with intelligence, financial aid, and military technology. The Soviet Union also armed Iraq, while France became one of its biggest weapons suppliers. Even Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, fearing Iran's influence, poured billions of dollars into Iraq's war effort. Iran, largely isolated, was forced to acquire weapons through clandestine channels, sometimes from unlikely sources like Israel, and even through secret deals with elements within the U.S. government, as revealed in the Iran-Contra affair. The war was no longer just between Iran and Iraq. It was a proxy battleground for global interests. In 1984, the conflict spilled into the sea, opening a new and dangerous front, the tanker war. Both Iran and Iraq began attacking oil tankers and merchant ships in the Persian Gulf, including those from neutral countries. Their goal was to cripple each other's economies by cutting off vital oil exports. The Gulf became one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. This escalation drew the international community in directly. The United States and other naval powers sent warships to the Gulf to escort their tankers and protect the free flow of oil, raising the terrifying prospect of a direct confrontation between American forces and Iran. But perhaps the darkest chapter of this brutal war was the widespread use of chemical weapons. Iraq, in desperation, deployed mustard gas, sarin, and other nerve agents against Iranian troops. Soldiers who survived the initial attacks suffered from horrific burns, blindness, and lifelong respiratory illnesses. The most infamous atrocity occurred not against soldiers but against civilians. In 1988, in the Kurdish town of Halabja in northern Iraq, Saddam's forces unleashed a chemical cocktail on his own people, who he accused of siding with Iran. Thousands of men, women, and children died in the streets, a silent, horrifying testament to the depths of the war's cruelty. By the late 1980s, both nations were utterly exhausted. Their economies were in ruins, their cities lay in rubble, and their populations were traumatized. After 8 long, brutal years of fighting, with no clear victory in sight for either side, the futility of the war became undeniable. In August 1988, a weary Ayatollah Khomeini finally agreed to a United Nations brokered ceasefire, famously describing the decision as more deadly than drinking poison. The guns finally fell silent. There were no victory parades, no celebrations, only a profound, deafening silence filled with grief and sorrow. The final toll was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million people were killed or wounded. Entire generations were scarred. Children grew up knowing only the sound of air raid sirens and the fear of bombs. When the fighting stopped, the borders had barely changed from where they were in 1980, all the death. All the destruction had been for nothing. The Iran-Iraq War changed the Middle East forever. It left both nations economically crippled and politically isolated. Yet, from the ashes of this tragedy, a new kind of national identity was forged in both countries, a hardened resolve, a deep-seated pride and a determination never to be seen as weak again. History often remembers wars in cold, hard numbers, 8 years, 1 million dead. But behind each number is a human story. A soldier writing a final letter home, a mother clutching a photograph, a city rising from its own ashes. The Iran-Iraq War was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of wills, of faith, and of survival. And its most enduring lesson is a painful one, echoed through the ages. In war, there are no true winners. There are only survivors left to pick up the pieces. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a difficult but important piece of history. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the events that have shaped our world. We'll see you next time.